God willing, as our chairman has said, our studies in this second session each morning is going to be on the subject of when David was old and full of days. In fact, do you know that what we're going to look at, God willing, is what I believe is the last 12 months of David's life. Just the last 12 months. Everything we're going to look at in our studies will be compressed into those last 12 months of David's life. And in fact, our story is going to start today in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 21. And if we turn to that chapter, it's a rather interesting one because you'll remember that this is the story of the plague that came upon Israel in the matter of the numbering of the nation. And God willing, our studies in essence are going to follow through the Chronicles record. And as we believe, in this chapter, the 1st of Chronicles chapter 21, we believe is the beginning of that last 12 months of David's life. I want you to notice something interesting about the 2nd of Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 1. You'll remember how the record says, "And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel." And as Christadelphians, as a community, we've been clear on the fact that the Satan of this chapter, in the corresponding parallel reference in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 24, the Satan is of course God himself. That Almighty God became an adversary to Israel, and as a community we believe and have taught that as part of our explanation of who or what the Satan of the Bible is. But did you notice this? Reading the verse again carefully, 1st of Chronicles 21 and verse 1, I want you to notice whom God came against on this occasion. The record says, "And Satan stood up against Israel," not the king. Did you notice that? God didn't stand against David, says the record. He stood against Israel. And you see, what's going to be unfolded in this particular chapter is that the primary purpose of this episode is for the humbling and the education of Israel, not the king. In fact, the circumstances that brought the plague upon the people, I think, already existed in the nation before David even began to number them. But the problem of this chapter will not be the king's sin, but the people's. All David was going to provide was the catalyst by which the sin of the people would be made manifest and known. Or, yes, Almighty God was going to stand against Israel on this occasion. And in this chapter, as we see David in his oldness of age, we're going to see how the old man became the sin bearer of his people in type. Well, the record says in chapter 21 and verse 1 that David numbered Israel. You know, we need to understand that there was nothing intrinsically wrong with numbering the people of Israel. We're told in Numbers chapter 1 that it was correct and appropriate to number the people to assess military strength. We're told in Numbers 26 that there was a numbering of the nation to determine the portions of the tribes in allotting the land. We're told in Numbers chapter 3 that there was a numbering for the organization of the Levites. There was nothing wrong in the matter of actually numbering Israel itself. So the question is, of course, why do you think David was numbering Israel on the occasion of the 1st of Chronicles chapter 21? Well, let me tell you what I believe he was doing. He's an old man, you see. I don't think he was concerned about further invasion. I don't think he was concerned about the possibility of a division or revolt within the land. I don't think he was concerned about the military strength of the army. I think David, as an old man, had already gone in his mind to the things that were dearest to him and most important in his life. And I think that the thing that was of greatest importance in his life at this time, in the words of a psalm, was "The zeal of thine house hath eaten me up, And in David's oldness of age, all he wanted to do was to organize the nation in the matter of the things of spiritual worship that would take place around the house of God, and he wanted to have that done before he died. Now let me show you why I believe that to have been the reason for David's numbering on this occasion in the 1st of Chronicles 21. You see how the record unfolds subsequently. Come to chapter 22. In the 1st of Chronicles chapter 22, it's going to say this in verse 2. And David commanded to gather together the strangers that were in the land, and he set masons to hew wrought stones to build the house of God. And he didn't just gather the strangers, 1st of Chronicles 22 verse 2, he numbered them. Says the 2nd of Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 17. He numbered the strangers to assess the manpower that was available for the temple construction. If you come to the 1st of Chronicles 23, one chapter later, we're told this in verse 24. It says in verse 24, "These were the sons of Levi after the house of their fathers, even the chief of their fathers, as they were counted by number of names, by their polls, that did the work for the service of the house of the Lord, from the age of 20 years and upwards." And if we were to ask, brothers and sisters, well, who numbered the names of verse 24? The answer is, verse 27, by the last words of David, the Levites were numbered. So he numbered the Levites, says chapter 23, for the service of the house of God. In chapter 25 and verse 1, the record says, "Moreover, David and the captains of the host separated to the service of the sons of Asaph and of Heman and of Jeduthun, who should prophesy with harps and psalteries and with cymbals. And the number of the workmen according to their service was..." And verse 7 says, "So the number of them with their brethren that were instructed in the songs of the Lord." So David numbered the singers, says the 1st of Chronicles 25, verse 1. He numbered the singers to set them in their courses in the house of God. In the 1st of Chronicles chapter 27 and verse 1, the record says, "Now the children of Israel after their number, to wit the chief fathers and captains of thousands and hundreds, and their officers that served the king." So 1st of Chronicles 27 verse 1 says that David numbered the captains and officers, that the organization of the kingdom might be administered properly after his death. And in fact, if you come to chapter 27 and verses 23 to 24, the record says this, verse 23, "But David took not the number of them from 20 years old and under, because Yahweh had said that he would increase Israel like to the stars of heaven." And I think that this very reference to David's census in the midst of all his numbering tells us why he was doing all this. Why did he number Israel in chapter 21? And the answer is for the same reason as chapter 22 and 23 and 24 and 25 and 27. He was numbering the nation for the proper organization of the spiritual objectives of the house of God, and he wanted it done, if at all possible, before he died. He wanted to know the tally of those that were capable for the service of the administration. And so you notice what the record says in chapter 27, verse 23, that he deliberately did not count those who were under the age of 20, because he felt it irreverent to count what God himself had promised should be countless. No, he just numbered the ones that were able to be involved in the work of the house of God in one way or another. And you see what verse 24 says, 1 Chronicles 27, verse 24. "Joab the son of Zeruiah began to number, but he finished not, because there fell wrath for it against," not David, "no, against Israel," says the record. "Neither was the number put in the account of the Chronicles of King David." So coming back to the 1st of Chronicles chapter 21, I believe that David's motives on this occasion were pure and excellent. in the matter of the numbering of the nation for the service of the house of God. But whilst the king's objectives were pure, the nation's weren't. And verse 3 of 1 Chronicles 21 says, "And Joab answered, Yahweh make his people 100 times so many more as they be, but my lord the king, are they not all my lord's servants? Why then doth my lord require this thing? Why will he be a cause of trespass to Israel?" Do you know, brothers and sisters, Joab's comments were not prompted, I believe, by any spiritual concern. There was treachery afoot in the nation at this very moment of time. Why, the revolt of Adonijah was soon to manifest itself, and Joab was deeply involved in that very thing. Better that David not know the exact state of the nation at the moment. It might have been that Joab misunderstood David's intention, and he thought he merely wanted a tally of the fighting men. That's certainly what he brings back, as the record's going to tell us in verse 5, but it's not what David asked for. In the parallel record in the 2nd of Samuel 24 and verse 2, David expressly asked that they go and number all the people and bring the tally of all the people back to him. On the other hand, if Joab did know David's true motive, then he probably also knew that the heart of the nation was not with their king. Israel had no interest or desire to devote their resources to the building of a house for God. And Joab, ever the pragmatic realist, sought to dissuade David from his commitment to a cause that he knew the nation did not share. But David was resolute, says verse 4. Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab, and wherefore Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came to Jerusalem. And you see, I think that David had another reason. If you come to the book of Exodus in chapter 30, I think in addition to numbering those in the nation for the purposes of the house of God, David had another reason for asking for this numbering. You see what it says in Exodus chapter 30 and verse 12. Exodus 30 says, verse 12, maybe verse 11 for connection. "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, When thou takest the sum of the children of Israel after their number, then they shall give every man a ransom for his soul. And that ransom, says verse 13, was a half shekel of the sanctuary. And verse 15 says, the rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less than half a shekel. No, each person numbered must give half a shekel. And for what purpose was the half shekel given or devoted? The answer says in verse 16, thou shalt take the atonement money of the children of Israel and shall appoint it for the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. So every time Israel was numbered, they all had to pay half a shekel, and that half shekel was devoted to the matters of the tabernacle. And I think that David saw a practical benefit in swelling the funds for the building of a house for God, that in numbering the nation they would also give their half shekel for the sanctuary to be built. At least that was his intention. But as the story unfolded, David would find that the spirit of his people were not with him. And so coming back to the 1st of Chronicles, chapter 21, the record says in verse 5 that Joab gave the sum of the number of the people unto David. Verse 6 says, and strangely so, that funnily enough, in the census that Joab took, for some reason Levi and Benjamin were not there. They were omitted from the tally. I think we know why Levi was omitted, because, well, they were left out on the basis of the precedent of Numbers chapter 1, which said that Levi had no inheritance amongst the tribes, and so they weren't counted on an earlier census, Numbers 1, verses 47 to 50. Perhaps Joab omitted them for the same reason here, and certainly David is going to number them separately himself in chapter 23. But why did he omit Benjamin, do you think, brothers and sisters, did Joab in his census? Well, that's a question that unfortunately we haven't got time to answer today. But God willing, we shall find the reason by and by as our studies unfold on the morrow. So do you know what the result of this census was? There was an imperfect tally taken by a commander who wished to frustrate its purpose and counted among a people who did not enter into its spirit or share its objective. And what David had not realized, brothers and sisters, is that the heart of his people was not with him in this matter. And verse 7 says, and read it carefully, and God was displeased with this thing, therefore he smote Israel, not the king, Israel. Where would be the justice, brothers and sisters, in God smiting 70,000 people for something that the king had sinned concerning? Oh no, the judgment in this chapter is going to fall fairly and squarely upon those with whom the fault lay. And the fault was not with the king, brothers and sisters, but with the people of the king who did not share his spirit of dedication to the truth. And David said, verse 8, he said unto God, I have sinned greatly because I have done this thing, but now I beseech thee, do away the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly. I think, you see, before the judgment fell, that David already had a premonition of woe. He felt a sense of guilt in the matter. Isn't that typical of David's spirit? It wasn't his fault, brothers and sisters, but he was prepared to take the blame, nevertheless, on behalf of his people. It's the spirit of an old man who knew only too well the weakness of sin in his own life and who readily assumed responsibility for the offense. I'm the shepherd, he says, it's all my fault. I shouldn't have done this, he says in his prayer to God. But it wasn't David's fault, was it really? The main fault didn't lie with the king. And I'll tell you why we know that, because you see what the record goes on to say. Verse 9 says that Gad, the king's seer, came to speak to him the words of God and said, verse 10, thus saith Yahweh, I offer thee three things. Choose one of them that I may do it unto thee. So Gad came to David and said unto him, thus saith Yahweh, choose thee either 3 years famine, or 3 months to be destroyed before thy foes, while that the sword of thine enemies overtake thee, or else 3 days, the sword of Yahweh, even the pestilence in the land, and the angel of Yahweh destroying throughout all the coasts of Israel. Now therefore advise thyself what word I shall bring again to him that sent me. Do you notice that all the judgments offered, brothers and sisters, are national judgments, not individual? Either 3 years famine for the nation, or 3 months before their enemies for the nation, or a pestilence through all the coasts of Israel. It's not an individual judgment against an individual man. They're national judgments for a national sin. For Yahweh was displeased with Israel on this occasion. If there was a sin on David's part, and I think there was, perhaps in a sense, brothers and sisters, the only sin that David had committed in this matter was this. Verse 30, right at the end of this story, verse 30, David could not go to the tabernacle to inquire of God. You see, that's the one thing he hadn't done before this matter of the numbering. He had not inquired of God before proceeding. And of course, he'd done this on an earlier occasion. Remember when he wanted to bring the ark to Zion? He began before he inquired of God, says the record, in the 1st of Chronicles 15 and verse 13. And again now, in his eagerness to further the divine purpose, he began before he asked God. And if that was a sin, then David had committed that, but naught else had the king done on this occasion. Let me just finalize that for you by coming to the 1st of Kings, chapter 15. Hold your hand in Chronicles and come back to the 1st of Kings, chapter 15, because here is the divine summary upon the life of David. 1 Kings 15, verses 4 and 5. The record says this: "And nevertheless, for David's sake did Yahweh his God give him a lamp in Jerusalem to set up his son after him and to establish Jerusalem, because David did that which was right in the eyes of Yahweh and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite." There is nothing laid to the charge of David in the summary of his life, is there, brothers and sisters, concerning the numbering of Israel? Oh no, this wasn't David's sin on this occasion. 'Twas the people's. And you see what happens back in the 1st of Chronicles, chapter 21, and reading from verse 14, because this is what the record says. Verse 13, perhaps, before we move on. "David said unto Gad, I am in a great strait. Let me fall now into the hand of the Lord, for very great are his mercies, but let me not fall into the hand of man." It's interesting, brothers and sisters, I sort of thought about these plagues, and I think there's something interesting about what David decided. See, if the matter of a famine had come in the land, would David personally have been affected by a famine, do you think? He in the royal palace, with charge of the royal orchards and the royal herds. Do you think David in the palace would have suffered from a famine that came upon the people? Or even if they had had 3 months before their enemies, why, David had already retired from the field of battle by this time, being too old because of the fading of his powers. We're told that in the book of Samuel. He'd already left the army. He was fighting no longer. Do you think the king in his palace would have been in danger from the sword of the enemies? But what if he chose the plague? The plague could reach out and touch anybody, couldn't it? Even the king. And the choice that David makes in falling into the hands of God, he says, I choose the plague. If it be me, Almighty God, then might the pestilence touch me also. And he casts his lot with his people as their sin bearer. He shares with them in the calamity. And verse 14 says, 1st of Chronicles 21, "So Yahweh sent pestilence upon Israel, and there fell of Israel 70,000 men." And the parallel record says, from Dan to Beersheba, 70,000 men. Do you know that 70 is the number of the Gentiles? You see, these weren't Israelites in faith. They were behaving like Gentiles. They hadn't shown the spirit of Israelitish faith. They hadn't responded to the matters of giving generously for the work of the sanctuary. And I believe, by the way, that the 70,000 that fell in verse 14 fell in sequence. I think the angel of God began where the tally had begun. And I think the angel of God traveled through the land to every place where the census had come. City by city, town by town, village by village, tribe by tribe, the angel traveled on the same journey, and the 70,000 that fell were selected by the angel, one by one, expressly, deliberately, individually. And I think in the exquisite providence of God, the 70,000 that fell were no doubt, every one of them, those who had not paid the shekel of the sanctuary, the half shekel, and not entered into the spirit of the king on this occasion. Oh yes, I think the judgment fell in the right place on every man or woman that fell. And by the time the journey of that angel had traveled thus far, David knew that it would end in Jerusalem, where the tally had finally come. And that's why verse 15 says that God sent an angel unto Jerusalem to destroy it, and as he was destroying, the Lord beheld and repented him of the evil, and said to the angel that destroyed, It is enough, stay now thine hand. And the angel of the Lord stood by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And verse 15 becomes like a summary of what's going to happen, and then from verse 16 onwards we're going to have the expanded story of how that all occurred. And it says this, verse 16, David lifted up his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord stand between the earth and the heaven, having a drawn sword in his hand, stretched out over Jerusalem. And David and the elders of Israel, who were clothed in sackcloth, fell upon their faces. I think the king was in sackcloth before the angel came to the city. He knew it was on its way. He'd heard the reports of death in the land. And by the time the angel came, the king was on his face in prayer. And this is what he said, verse 17. David said unto God, Is it not I that commanded the people to be numbered? Even I it is that have sinned and done evil indeed. But as for these sheep, what have they done? Let thine hand, I pray thee, O Yahweh my God, be on me and on my father's house, but not on thy people, that they should be plagued. It's all my fault, says the king. I accept the blame. I'm the shepherd. These are but the sheep. Do you know, when he says that, brothers and sisters, I think he's referring back to Exodus chapter 30. Now, just hold your hand in the 1st of Chronicles 21 and come back to Exodus chapter 30, because you see what it says in the matter of the numbering of the nation. There's just one little phrase that I think connects with David's language here. I've sinned, but these sheep, what have they done? Do you notice how that in Exodus chapter 30, in the matter of numbering Israel, the record says this, verse 13, it says, And this they shall give every one that passeth among them. And again, verse 14, every one that passeth among them. Now, you see that word passeth among them. It's a word that means, well, the Hebrew word is quite wide in its application, but one of the ways in which it's used is of the flock of sheep being tallied under the rod of the shepherd who counts them. It's used that way in Ezekiel chapter 20 verse 37, in Leviticus chapter 27 verse 32, in Jeremiah chapter 33 and verse 13, the flock of sheep under the rod of the shepherd who counts them, those that pass by one. And so when David says, these sheep, what have they done? It's all my fault in 1st of Chronicles 20. Don't lose Exodus, by the way. In effect, he says, well, I counted them, it's me to blame. But it wasn't really David to blame, was it? And did you notice what Exodus said in chapter 30, brothers and sisters, in verse 12, just reading again a little more carefully? When thou takest the sum of the children of Israel after their number, then shall they give every man a ransom for his soul. They all had an individual responsibility. The king shouldn't pay. It was the people's responsibility. And look what happens if they didn't. They will give every man a ransom for his soul unto the Lord, when thou numberest them, that there be no plague among them when thou numberest. And in the exquisite providence of God, brothers and sisters, in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 21, the divine judgment that fell upon the nation was why the plague promised in Exodus chapter 30 and verse 12, because each man and each woman in Israel had not lived up to their individual responsibility to pay the half shekel as the law bid them to do, and the plague fell, and rightly so. But on the people, not the king. So when David says in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 17, it is I that have sinned, but as for these sheep, what have they done? What have they done? Let thine hand, I pray thee, O Lord my God, be on me and on my father's house, but not on thy people. Can you hear the echo in that verse, brothers and sisters, of another man in another place at another time that said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Or yes, I think the spirit of David here is the spirit of Christ, you see, that becomes the sin bearer for his people. And just as David was to become the sin bearer, so he was to become the saviour and the deliverer of his people on this occasion, as the record is going to unfold. And so he's told to go to the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, as the record tells us. We're told in 1 Chronicles 21 and verse 22, David said to Ornan, "Grant me the place of this threshing floor, that I may build an altar therein unto Yahweh." And again in verse 25, so David gave to Ornan for the place 600 shekels of gold. Mind you, that wasn't before Ornan said this in verse 23. Ornan said unto David, "Take it to thee, and let my lord the king do that which is good in his eyes. Lo, I give thee not only the place, but the oxen also for burnt offering, and the threshing instruments for wood, and the wheat for the meal offering. I give it all," says Ornan. And here, brothers and sisters, was a Gentile who gave generously for the work of the truth, the very spirit that Israel had failed to show on this occasion. The nation would not respond to the request of the king. He was a Gentile that put them all to shame in terms of the generous spirit that he would show for the work of the truth. And David said, "No, I will pay." And he gave him 600 shekels of gold by weight, says verse 25, for the place. Would you notice that, by the way? The place. He paid for the place. And again, verse 22, "Grant me the place." Do you know, I think that's an allusion, and a very clear one, to the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 12. Now, we don't really have time to look at this, but, well, let's just do it anyway. Deuteronomy chapter 12, but just very briefly. We can't savour the fullness of the passage, but did you notice this in Deuteronomy chapter 12? You see, here's a revelation being given to David, even in the midst of the calamity of the moment. It says, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 5, that when they were to come into the land, it says, "Unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name there, even unto his habitation shall ye seek, and thither thou shalt come." Verse 13, "Take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest, but in the place which Yahweh shall choose in one of thy tribes, there thou shalt offer thy burnt offerings." And David has now been shown by revelation that the place of Deuteronomy chapter 12, where the habitation of God shall be, is none other than Mount Moriah, where the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite has been. And it's been revealed to David on the occasion of this national calamity, where the place of God's house and altar shall be. And coming back to Chronicles, the record says, in verse 26, David built there an altar and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings and called upon the Lord, and he answered him from heaven by fire upon the altar of burnt offering. And then it says that God commanded the angel, and he put up his sword again into his sheath. You know that we're told in the Samuel record, in the 2nd of Samuel 24 and verse 25, that the pestilence fell from the morning until the time appointed. And I think that that time appointed, as best as we can ascertain, was the time of the evening sacrifice. And it is my personal belief, brothers and sisters, that because of the prayers of the king, although the pestilence was to fall for 3 days, that it ceased at the end of the very first day because of the intercession of the king on behalf of his people. It began in the morning, but by night time it had stopped. And although there was weeping for that period of time, by the next morning it was clear to all Israel that the plague had been stayed and the nation had been saved. And Yahweh in his mercy had shortened the judgment and asked the angel to cease. It is enough. The prayers of the king had saved his people. Now, do you know that in the course of these studies, brothers and sisters, one of the things that we're going to do is to try and enter into the very spirit and mind of David himself. And how we're going to do that is we're going to try and find the psalms that David composed at this time. And each of our studies, we're going to discover a psalm that I believe David wrote at this precise moment of time as a revelation of his mind. And I think David wrote a psalm just at the moment of the 1st of Chronicles 21. Would you like to see that then? Well, yes, of course we would. So hold your hand in the 1st of Chronicles 21 and come to the 30th Psalm, because I think this is the moment when David composed this particular psalm to the Father. Now, do you see what it says in Psalm 30 at the heading of the psalm? Psalm 30 says, a psalm and song at the dedication of the house of David. The New American Standard Bible alters the heading slightly, and I think correctly, when it says this: a psalm, a song at the dedication of the house, full stop. And then it says, of David, meaning that the psalm is of David, but not the house. It's not the house of David that's being dedicated on this occasion, it's the dedication of God's house. And it's David's psalm concerning the dedication of that house. Do you know the word dedication in the heading of Psalm 30 is the Hebrew word Chanukah. You've probably heard that word, Chanukah. And it means literally to consecrate by the offering of dedicatory sacrifices. We're told, for example, in Numbers 7, verses 87 to 88, that the altar of Moses was dedicated Chanukah by the offering of sacrifices. We're told in the 2nd of Chronicles, chapter 7, verses 4 and 5, that the house of Solomon was dedicated Chanukah by the offering of sacrifices. We're told in Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 27 and verse 43, that the wall of Nehemiah was dedicated Chanukah by sacrifices. And now we have a psalm at the Chanukah of the house of God. But those sacrifices, aren't they what David offers in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 21? Read again, verse 26. And David built there an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and called upon God. Verse 28, at that time when David saw that Yahweh had answered him in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, then he sacrificed there. And those sacrifices were the offerings of dedication. And what was he dedicating, brothers and sisters? Just the altar, you think? Or more than the altar. This was the place of God's habitation of Deuteronomy chapter 12. And do you see what the 1st of Chronicles 22 and verse 1 says? Then David said, this is the house of the Lord God, and this is the altar of burnt offering for Israel. And although that house was never built in David's lifetime, David had been revealed where the house should be and had dedicated that house with the sacrifices of 1st of Chronicles chapter 21. Oh yes, I think this psalm was written at the moment of the dedication of the 1st of Chronicles chapter 21, when the place on Mount Moriah was sanctified by David's offerings. Well, here's a break up to the psalm. Don't lose Chronicles, but do keep Psalm 30. And the break up to the psalm is as follows. Verses 1 to 3, thanksgiving for deliverance. Thanksgiving for deliverance. Now, why do you think, brothers and sisters, in a psalm commemorating the dedication of God's house, would David need to offer thanks for deliverance, unless the nation had at that very time experienced a calamity for which deliverance was necessary? And yet that's the theme of the psalm. And then verses 4 and 5, joy in forgiveness. Verses 4 and 5, joy in forgiveness, which was the very experience of the nation after the prayers of the king. Verses 6 to 10 of the psalm, supplication for help. Supplication for help, verses 6 to 10. And finally, verses 11 to 12, gladness in praise. Gladness and praise. You know what this psalm's all about, brothers and sisters? It's the bittersweet mixture of two things. David's awe and amazement at the revelation of the place of God's house, and the grief and anguish that accompanied that revelation, since it followed on the calamity of the death of so many people in the nation. All those bittersweet emotions woven together in Psalm 30 at the dedication of the house of God. Now, just let me show you the psalm in the chapter. So you see how 1 Chronicles 21 says in verse 16 at the end of the verse, "Then David and the elders of Israel who were clothed in sackcloth fell upon faces. And so they were until the plague was stayed." But then that would be Psalm 30 in verse 11, wouldn't it? "Thou hast turned for me my mourning into dancing. Thou hast put off my sackcloth and girded me with gladness." And when David offered the offerings of the 1 of Chronicles 21 and verse 26, and we're told that God answered and spoke to his angel and cut short the calamity, well, isn't that the words of Psalm 30 and verse 5? "For his anger endureth but a moment, in his favour is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." And on the next morning, on the second morning, when the plague ought to have still been there, the nation awoke to find that the plague was ended and over, and joy had come, despite the weeping of the day before and of the night that followed. Oh yes, I think this is the very psalm of the deliverance of the nation after this dreadful calamity. And you see what verse 4 says of Psalm 30? "Sing unto Yahweh, O ye saints of his, and give thanks at the remembrance of his holiness." The margin says, "Give thanks at the memorial of his holiness." And do you know that Exodus chapter 30 and verse 16 says that that half shekel that was paid was to be offered as a memorial before God? Do you know the nation would never forget again the memorial of God's holy requirements after the calamity of this occasion had come upon them? And so when Psalm 30 verse 8 says, "I cried to thee, O Yahweh, and unto Yahweh I made supplication," David's cry was not just for himself, brothers and sisters, but for the nation who were in such desperate trouble at that time. Yes, he prayed on behalf of all of them. This is the bittersweet story of Psalm 30, when so many in the nation lost their lives, and yet at the very same time to David was given the revelation of the place of God's house where forgiveness would finally be found for all people. And Psalm 30 verse 2 says, "O Yahweh my God, I cried unto thee, and thou hast healed me. O Yahweh, thou hast brought up my soul from the grave. Thou hast kept me alive, that I should not go down to the pit." And of course, we know, do we not, brothers and sisters, in a plague of the 1 of Chronicles chapter 21, that the king was spared, was he not? 70,000 perished of Israel, but not the king. It didn't touch the king. And yet the words of Psalm 30 in verse 2 and verse 3 imply that in some way the king himself experienced, well, "Thou hast healed me," says the record. "Thou hast brought up my soul from the grave. Thou hast kept me alive." There's something very personal about the words of David on the occasion of this psalm. And I think that's true. I think that what actually happened, brothers and sisters, that although the king's life was spared, I think that David himself was afflicted in this calamity so profoundly that he was brought to the very dust of death himself. So how did that happen then, brothers and sisters? Well, that, God willing, is our study tomorrow.